spill over the wall. Well, thank you very much, Carol, for the invitation, and for all of you for coming out. I really appreciate you coming to hear about the book, which I won't try to read from front to back or to show you every picture in it, but I'll try to package it in a way that at least gives you maybe something a little bit different from what's in the book, and food for thought and discussion afterward. I'll try to keep it to the 30 or 40 minutes, although I have way more slides than I can possibly cover in that. So if you want more slides, you can just tell me to keep going. So my confession is that I've never been, I have read the book, but I've never been to the Skyscraper Museum before. So this was my excuse to do it, and I wish I could spend more time looking at the exhibits, and I certainly will come back to do it. So to talk about the book, the book started out as my dissertation at Columbia, which Carol kindly mentioned. And like many dissertations, it started out as the search for some tiny little patch of unplowed ground in the academic fields where people hadn't written before, or hadn't written enough, or hadn't written something relevant enough. And I was really thrilled to find that the history of preservation was one of those unplowed patches of ground for the most part. Daniel Bluestone was my advisor at the time, put me onto a set of reports of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, which, and this is sort of an insider group, everybody's shaking their head, of course. But the archives and the reports of that group and all of the places where that led to lots of different sites and lots of different people led me to this, what to me was a great realization that there was an historic preservation field in New York in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And it didn't just exist on paper, but they actually did a lot. And they were really interesting people. And they opened up this really interesting window to me on this historical moment that is incredibly important in New York's history. I think in urban history anywhere. This time around the turn of the 20th century, when New York was becoming this great global, as Ken Jackson put it, the capital of capitalism. All the reasons that the skyscrapers, the subways, and all these great tropes of modernity and urban modernity were happening at the same time that these people who didn't quite identify as preservationists at the very same time that this great bout of city building was going on, the preservation field was also coming into focus, was also general. And as one of the sort of take-home messages of the book, and the thing that was most surprising to me in doing the research, is that the people who were creating the preservation field as this urban concern were also the city builders. They weren't just a bunch of criticizers and protesters and blue bloods who didn't really have anything better to do. There were some of those, but for the most part, they were the city builders. And so I'll talk a little bit about this I think, really interesting insight about who these early preservationists were and how that leads us to see preservation in a somewhat different light even today. That it's not just a sort of rarefied concern for those few of us who appreciate in great detail old buildings. It really is this robust public issue that lots of people have something to say about, and that bring a lot of different issues to the table, not just the connoisseurial, curatorial attitude toward great buildings. The way I thought to structure the talk tonight was to talk a little bit about the sort of bigger issues, and probably even try to explain why to do a preservation talk in a skyscraper museum was one of the things I was trying to figure out. One of the things I wanted to just highlight first before getting into some of the detail and showing you a lot more of the pictures that are in the book was how the big picture issues I think are important. In these decades around 1900, there are a couple of incredibly important things happening in the whole world and in New York in particular around this idea of modernity, which is defined in lots of different ways by lots of different fields. And I won't try to define it, but one of the key, one could say the central issue in modernity is a new kind of relation between the past and the present. And that's worked out in different fields and in different ways. You can see it in art, you can see it in poetry, you can see it in music, and you can see it, of course, in architecture. And it also shows up in fields that are not art with a capital A, but anything that really has to do with culture. Preservation is centrally about culture because at base, one of the motivations for it was to try to construct this new relationship to the past in cities, using buildings and landscapes and the urban environment to try to create, literally try to create a culture that could both embrace the present and the future, the city that New York was becoming, in our case, but also stay attached to the past. Because the way that the relationship in modernity changed, the relationship with the past, is that tradition was no longer this continuous attachment that we had to either our family or our congregations or our towns or our national culture even. That was all mixed up because of a number of really cataclysmic changes in the world. So without that safe and predictable relationship with tradition, how would we understand the past? How would we, in fact, create a new relationship to it? Well, keeping old buildings around as the city grew was one of the ways that happened. So at a number of different scales, from the sort of streetscape to the building scale to things like urban parks, and I would argue in the prospect of the whole city, this whole regional metropolis that New York was becoming in the early 20th century, preservation didn't just happen to come on the scene. It was one of the key ingredients to making the modern metropolis. In other words, without the sort of cultural function that preservation represented, of trying to stay attached to the past, even as the city changed so much, that it wouldn't be possible. And indeed, in a lot of the work and careers and words of people who were involved and influential in preservation, they were very conscious of how preservation was connected to city building, that the future and the past were not seen as something in contradiction or in conflict or irreconcilable. They were quite literally seen as fused together. And so in their work, whether it's forming institutions or designing projects or funding projects, they were trying to fuse past and future. And again, this might seem like a very commonplace thing for those of us in the early, I almost said late 20th century. It reflects when I started this project. In the early 21st century, that might seem like a really commonplace kind of insight, but it wasn't, I don't think, for the history of preservation, where the few people who had deigned to write about the history of preservation saw it as very much this sort of curatorial, and I don't use that as a bad word, but just as a sort of narrow, a very narrow framework that was about saving a few old buildings as an end in itself. Whereas in the main, the movers and shakers who were preservationists in the late 19th, early 20th century were doing preservation because it was a means to an end of a better city, a livable city, a city where the culture sort of taught you not just how to behave in an instrumental way, because they definitely did do that, but it gave you enough familiarity in old buildings, old landmarks, parks that had been used for a long time to make change comfortable. Let me try to illustrate that with a few slides from the book. If you go to the next. I'm sorry, I'm used to having the trigger in my hand, so I keep going like that. There's a number of pictures in the book, 15 or so, in a little portfolio that are taken from the collection of the Art Commission, who in 1913 commissioned a guy named Frank Cousins, who is essentially a businessman with a camera, not really a photographer, to make 50 photographs of buildings that the Art Commission thought would disappear, but were very valuable. And the Art Commission at that time included very important people like Robert Forrest and Isaac Newton Stokes. And these photographs are sort of incidentally brilliant and wonderful documents about this moment of change when modernity was happening, and these guys were trying to capture the past in a meaningful way. This is the Skank Crook House in Flatlands of Brooklyn, which in a way sort of lets preservation have it their old way of saving an isolated landmark, and you can see you'll see no context to it other than the sort of the natural setting. You can't really see the growing chaotic city around it. And you can see the little kid in the picture. I don't know if he's there for scale or just wandered in, but the lower left, lower right. Next picture, please. I think the more meaningful picture from the same series is this one of a few townhouses on State Street, where you get the sense with the streetcar rushing past and the construction of the sewers and subway, whatever it is, with a pile of rubble and the pipes in the street, the tall buildings around, the sort of the seeming sort of architectural chaos, that this is a moment of great change, and the preservation was entering into this if not sort of intentionally by this photographer, certainly the people who commissioned this photograph were definitely entering into and trying to sort of essentially create fused images like this that they could have it both ways. They could have future and past. Next, please. The context for this was, of course, the wild, fantastic, successful growth of New York City. This is an image that I think captures that really nicely. I don't think it was meant to be ironic, but I think it's a wonderfully ironic image. The title is City Hall. The approach to City Hall today, or if it's called City Hall today, of course you can't find City Hall because of all the growth around it, because City Hall managed in this wonderful preservation success story to stay central to the city. It was so central that the land grant became so valuable that all the newspaper buildings on Park Row, the Woolworth building, the municipal building, and everything else around it, nearly everything else around it, say St. Paul's, blotted it out, or nearly so. So this became one of the great preservation threat stories of how to save City Hall from its centrality, if you will. Next, please. The other sort of interesting narrative that I tried to weave into the book, I'm not sure that I did as successfully as I wanted to, because it sort of came along, in my mind, a little bit late in the game, was how people who we identify as modernists, or the capital M, working in New York in the early part of the 20th century, was how they dealt with, or did they represent this tension and this fusion between past and future. And someone like Raymond Hood in this drawing, this is a part of a series of sketches where he's working out what the new zoning ordinance would look like. I think it's from 1924 or so.
27.
Sorry?
27.
27, thank you. I always, there are always at least 3 times when I do these talks that I'm corrected by experts, greater than myself in the audience, so I welcome it. If you hear me making a mistake, please correct me. But I thought it was notable that someone so vaunted for his vision of the future and of how that future was represented in these wonderful, iconic, tall buildings that are not just drawings that became quite real. How and whether he represented the existing environment or the sort of chaotic environment in New York in which these buildings happen. And I thought it notable that he did make some sort of quasi-faithful effort to represent the context of these buildings, even if it was idealized. There was a grappling with this idea between the 1890s and 1920s that the past was something not just to be ignored, but to be reckoned with and used. Next, please. So, as I said, the preservationists, the ones who identify that, the ones who join the preservation groups, and the people who otherwise just happen to advocate causes or somehow appear on the preservation scene, they phrase it different ways, but one of the ways they phrase it is to try to create anchors against the change in the surrounding city. So this is the Abigail Adams Smith Museum, aka Smith's Folly, another part of this Art Commission series. That you can see from the gas tank leaning in the background that this is no longer the countryside. And so why try to preserve one of these buildings? It's reasons familiar to us today, but they refer to them as anchors of change or totems of old New York. What they all amount to, and go to the next one, please. They included not just buildings or old fragments left behind, but very heavily used urban spaces like Battery Park, just near where we are right now. The parks were a very important subject for the preservationists in this era, because they were historic in a sort of straightforward way, but also because they represented these other important uses and utilities as open space, as recreational space, increasing the value of real estate, and so on and so forth. What they all amounted to was, in the words of this great literary critic, Van Wyck Brooks, he coined this term, the usable past, to talk about what was going on in literature at the time and how American literature had to find a way to use its past in order to make a modern American literature. I think it pertains very well to preservation as well. And the preservationists were not just saving the past for its own sake, they were trying to make it useful to instruct citizens on how to be better Americans and better New Yorkers, instruct and use it to sort of modulate the kinds of change that was going on, not to protest against it. They protested against it very rarely, actually. It really was seen as part and parcel of this new project to modernize the city. Next, please. So one of the, how do we see this, how this fusion was happening? That was one of the challenges I faced as a researcher. And the two ways I tried to get at that was, number one, to look at the institutions and people, who they were and why they were doing what they were doing, why they were advocating for preservation. And the other was to look at particular sites and to look very carefully at how particularly valuable sites were treated over a long period of time. So the book consists, a large part of the book consists of 3 chapters, one each on case study: St. John's Chapel, City Hall Park, and the Bronx River Parkway, which I take up for a number of different reasons, and I'll talk about those in a moment. There are 2 really important characters, though, that speak really strongly to this fusion between, this modern fusion between the past and the future. Andrew Haswell Green on the left, who some of you probably know if you've encountered Mike Marcio sometime in the last 5 years. You know about him like you never had would have been able to before. Father of Greater New York, creator of many things, including Central Park, but by different definitions. Central Park, New York Public Library, certainly the 5-borough city. On the right, a little bit less well known, maybe there's a Mike Marcio out there for him too, is George McEnany. How many of you have heard of George McEnany in Cincinnati? Insider crowd, but still only about 6 or 7. He was an incredibly influential, quietly influential character who was involved in just a great proliferation of things between, say, 1900 and 1953 when he died. At the end of his life, he was one of the creators of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In Tony Wood's book, he tells the story of McEnany and others saving Castle Clinton. He was one of the managers of the 1939 World's Fair, started the Regional Plan Association. He was borough president. He was president of the Board of Aldermen, which was a significant position in its day. He was a public official. He was a newspaper man, businessman. He was a great civic leader by any definition. And I think if Moses hadn't been, Robert Moses hadn't been alive and working in an overlapping time period, I think we probably know a whole lot more about George McEnany than we do. But McEnany was really, in a fundamental way, a preservationist, and that he was dedicated to it his whole life, not just as a hobby, but as really part of the fabric of what he did as a civic leader. Two of the other things that he did, I usually say these first, I'm not sure why I left them out, is that he was responsible for the extension of the subway system in 1915 to essentially double the scope of the early subway system. An absolutely essential thing for New York, transforming from Manhattan as a city into a 5-borough metropolis. And he also got credit, or at least part of the credit, for writing the first skyscraper zoning ordinance. So it depends on whose letters you believe more, who gets credit for it. So he is really there. He's got his hands on the controls of making New York the capital of capitalism. And he's doing preservation at the same time. Next, please. So this is actually, I think, the last image, or one of the 2 last images in the book. It's a cartoon from the New York Times that I just think encapsulated a lot of this, the situation that these preservation advocates felt or faced in the 1920s and 1910s. The pictures where it shows the sort of probably typical cacophony of the street scene. There's the elevated train and the skyscrapers and the park and the sidewalk. I think this is around the Battery somewhere. And the illustrator captures it out of this weltering turmoil. New York of today fishes the past. And that seemed to me a sort of apt metaphor of these people who are really about building this great city. They tried to fish out a few select elements in order to sort of alloy the whole city and to make it sort of culturally whole by saving not just 1 or 2 little pieces of the past, but enough of them to make a difference in the presence on the street every day to New Yorkers. Next, please. This is a quick aside, occasioned by the exhibit that surrounds us on Shanghai. I've had the pleasure of taking several trips there in the last couple of years, including taking classes there to work on urban conservation projects in Shanghai. And I also went last week to the program in the Skyscraper Museum had with Ben Wood, who is an American architect who's made this really controversial and exciting project there about 10 years ago. And I think that there's a really strong argument for comparing the moment of New York at the turn of the 20th century with Shanghai at the turn of the 21st century in terms of preservation. Go to the next we can easily think of skylines, that's probably the sort of first subject we go to. But if you think about preservation, they're actually facing a lot of the same issues. Wholesale destruction of a kind and a pace that actually threatens people's sense of stability. And again, the sense of anchorage and stability is something that is a very current issue in Shanghai. Not very many people are worried about it, I give you that. But I think it is akin to what New York faced a long time ago. This is a district of early 20th century housing just in the outskirts of downtown that is quickly disappearing block by block for the skyscrapers that you see around. This is a block that we worked on in 2007, and remarkably it's actually still there. There are local preservation laws. There are some officials that are quite dedicated to ensuring that preservation is somehow part of the mix of what happens to Shanghai in this century. So I'll come back to New York now. Next slide, please. There are a couple of sort of headline findings from the book, and these are not the sort of things that I probably articulated very clearly in the introduction or conclusion. So I thought I would just go through them now, not so much to repeat what's in the book, as just to highlight what I think it means. Point number one is that there was a preservation field in New York before the 1960s. The heroic story of Penn Station that we all know is all true, but it also blots out everything that went before it, or tends to blot out everything that went before it. So I think that the decades and generations of preservation accomplishments before the 1960s are obscured by this, and so we have to get out of our taste for hero stories in preservation and to try to recover a lot of the work that went on before that. I always have to point out both Jane Jacobs and Philip Johnson in the picture. Philip Johnson without his glasses. Next, please. City Hall in the foreground. The second point is that the projects, preservation projects, the wins, the institutions that were formed, the ideas that drove the preservation field in the early 20th century were quite advanced. They're not sort of baby steps that we might regard them today looking backward. We tend to look at our landmarks a lot today, and even though if we might criticize them around the edges these days, we see that as such a great accomplishment that anything that came before it must have been sort of not very worthwhile. But there were lots of things going on in this time period that are very worth the study. The other thing to note is that preservation was not alone as an urban reform field and coming to life, coming of age in this time. It grew up very much alongside city planning, landscape architecture, the parks and playground movement, and so on and so on. All of these sort of cousin movements within the progressive umbrella that were out to make a better city by making a better environment, making better people by making a better environment. Preservation is very clearly part of that. Thirdly, next please. I just want to point again to the people who are involved in preservation, particularly McEnany. Here he is as the borough president, presiding at the opening of a Lafayette Memorial from the Journalism School at Columbia. Next. And here's essentially New York's board of directors, the borough president, the comptroller, the president of the board of aldermen, that's McEnany, second from the right, in City Hall. So this is the sort of board of directors of the city, and the fact that he was doing preservation at the same time is pretty remarkable. Next, please. So the idea that past and present were being fused, I think, is really nicely captured in this image. It's also on the cover of the book. It's of, sorry, Bill, getting your way. It's of City Hall Park in probably about 1914 or 1915. I'm not sure exactly what the date is. But the two notable things about it, and the thing that makes it really a great metaphor for preservation is sort of putting hands on the city to try to protect some parts and let other parts change, is that the airplanes and the municipal building are not part of the original photograph. They were spliced in afterward to make that perfect image of New York's past and future being fused. There was this great desire to both have the stability of the past, City Hall, in its proper place, neither move nor alter dramatically, and all these great pieces of modern technology. And the airplane in 1914, 1915 was still pretty remarkable. Same goes with electricity. There's a bit of electricity happens later in the talk, where the introduction of electric lighting of historic monuments was seen as this great sort of. And lastly, I wanted to just to note that one of the most obvious legacies that we have in this early preservation movement are the places that remain, the places that they preserved. And although this is not the best example of it historically, this is the 1856 statue of George Washington in Union Square. But those places that were preserved by other generations well before us, we still use, we still reinterpret, we still use to put new memorials on after 9/11. I don't think it's just coincidental that these became the cultural touchstones in a time of great stress. So when the new memorials showed up on top of the old memorials in this case, I think that was quite a purposeful and comfortable thing to do. It's one of the roles that all these memory sites, as I call them, are part of the memory infrastructure. It's one of the roles that they play in the city. Next, please. So that's enough of the bigger picture. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the cases now and watch for Carol's hand about when I should stop and open up for questions. But I chose the 3 case studies I did partly because they helped me sample what was happening in different parts of the metropolis in the first part of the 20th century. As this 1909 image suggests, the city was fairly exploding with growth, not just vertically, as the skyscraper museum and all the skyscraper narratives amply document, but also horizontally. These rail lines out into Brooklyn, Queens, and up into the Bronx and Westchester County were part of this fundamentally new city. So the 3 sites that I chose, City Hall Park is right about here. St. John's Chapel was on the lower west side here, right where the Holland Tunnel exits are today. That was the park in front of St. John's Chapel. And the Bronx River Parkway I can't reach because it started at the Bronx Zoo. See those 2 little lakes right north of my paper. It started there and went 15 miles north into Westchester, into Bronx and Westchester County. So it was clearly the growing edge of the city in the early 20th century. Next. So this is a photograph of St. John's Chapel, and since that's probably less known and more interesting preservation story, maybe I'll dwell on that in a minute and give a very short shrift to the other 2. Next, please. City Hall Park, both the building, I talk about the park first and the building as a sort of secondary issue to capture the idea of a landscape as an historically significant place to these early preservationists and how the struggle is to both keep City Hall as an historic building in place and to restore it was a sort of minor story to the bigger one of keeping other buildings out of City Hall Park in order to give an appropriately green and park-like setting to the historical monument. They tried very hard, preservationists over years and years tried very hard to keep new buildings out of the park, mostly successful, and also to get rid of old buildings that were in the park and were crowding City Hall. So one of those great ironic moments when the preservationists were insisting that these old buildings be torn down. They happen to be those old buildings with the wrong political association between the courthouse and the old post office. So I'll maybe go into a little bit of detail on that later. But this is from an American Scenic and Historic Preservation report, I think from about 1910. And the caption says it all. The present post office, City Hall Park, as it appeared about 1830. I must have used the wrong image. There's another one that says, and as it should be restored. So this was the image that the preservationists were aiming for. These were old City Hall. Next, please. And so the Bronx River Parkway, clearly the least likely case study for a preservation book. But to me, it became a really important case to try to demonstrate this idea of fusing past and future, in that this was a very new landscape that was being created on the margins of the city for lots of different reasons. It was slum clearance, it was environmental cleanup, it was a real estate venture, it also became the first limited access automobile parkway, and the model for many others that came afterward. But the way that its builders pitched it, the way that they always introduced it and talked about it, was as a restoration of the Bronx River Valley, to restoring a landscape that once existed and that should exist again. So they were essentially using the past, however reconstructed and made up it may have been, the story of the Bronx Valley and the way it looked, or should look, as a way to justify all these other projects that were going on. And that becomes even more interesting when you get into the details of how this project was built and who was actually building it. Madison Grant was one of the 3 Bronx Parkway commissioners who led the whole project for 20 years. How many of you know Madison Grant? Stop. Oh, Owen, keep your hand out. Come on. So Madison Grant was a really interesting guy, and among his many interests and applications was scientific racism. And he wrote many popular books on eugenics, including The Passing of the Great Race and a couple of other ones that were, eugenics was a mainstream idea at that time, and he practiced the sort of politics of eugenics and immigration restriction and other sorts of what we see as various sort of arch and wrong-headed policies these days, as well as preserving big game. He was on the board of directors of the Bronx Zoo, and he built the Bronx River Parkway. And if you think the Bronx River Parkway was just sort of a hobby that he did on his spare time, he made every weekly meeting of the Bronx Parkway Commissioners for 20 years. And they were very, very meticulous record keepers. It's a fantastic archive. There's in fact both the photographs and the records. So a great story that is, one of the reasons that many people don't know about him is that his family burned his papers as soon as he passed away. And because they apparently included some pretty incriminating stuff. And there's really only one history that's been done of him by a PhD student a few years ago, which hopefully will someday be a book. Next, please. So the chapter preceding the 3 case studies, and I'll go through these really quickly, just tries to make the argument that preservationists and people who they were associated with created all sorts of what I call memory sites as part of this effort to help the city remember as it changed. And they included keeping old buildings in place and in use, like St. Paul's Chapel, the oldest building in Manhattan. Next, please. Things like the Dutch farmhouses in Brooklyn, and especially in Brooklyn. Next, please. Van Cortlandt Manor in the Bronx, the sort of fancy country houses. Next. Marcio Mansion, once in the country, but otherwise known as Washington's headquarters, and became a great house museum. Next. The interior of Marcio Mansion. This is the room where Lafayette slept. So when we sort of giggle about it these days about like how sort of trite sort of houses and museums are, and these reconstructed museums are, but this was very serious business. This was serious social reform in its day. This was where school children, Italian school children were brought to learn how to be Americans, quite literally. Next, please. Hamilton Grange, which is a great story in itself, in its original position here. Next. Moved once to get out of the way of this impending street grid, and this is great. Sort of you can sense that the speculative housing is sort of creeping toward it. We're just about ready to take it over. And next, it ends up next to being the rectory. It ends up being the rectory to St. Luke's Chapel, and of course, I don't have the slide of where it ended up. It's now around the corner in St. Nicholas Park. There was the preservationists for more than 100 years have been trying to move it from here, and Park Service finally did about 2 years ago. Next, please. Dyckman Farmhouse is a great story. One of these places, property of the Historic House Trust and the Parks Department opened it as a museum in 1915. Next, please. It was bought by the Dyckman ancestors who donated it to the city. But before they donated it, it was researched and restored by this remarkable pair of gentlemen, Alexander McMillan Welch, who was an architect, and Bashford Dean, who was the curator of ichthyology at the Natural History Museum, and the curator of arms and armor at the Met. And he designed museum displays. These 2 guys were brothers-in-law. They both married Dyckman sisters, and they created Dyckman House in 1915 along with others as this colonial farmhouse museum. Next, please. Francis Tavern, quite reconstructed, as many of us know. Next. Parks like Central Park. If you think of the 1910s, Central Park is already 50 years old and becoming regarded as an historic landscape as well as a useful park. Next, please. Sorry for the dark picture, but Fort Greene Park, with its great memorial just opened, great Stanford White Memorial to the Revolutionary War martyrs. another part of this great system of urban parks that, that clearly was one of the threatened resources to preservationists. Next. And new landscapes as well, like Riverside Park, as it gets created essentially as a real estate venture and as a partly naturalistic park, it also becomes a sort of display case for monuments and memorials, a sort of memory boulevard, not by design, but just by use. There's a Soldiers and Sailors Monument around 89th Street. As you know, those of you who know it and are familiar with it, there are all this sort of crazy collection of monuments that go up and down, firemen and Civil War generals and civic figures, and there's no real rhyme or reason for it other than this was regarded as good urban design, putting historical memorials in these new park spaces. Next, please. And then all sorts of smaller scale stuff like plaques and cannons. Next. The kinds of statuary and historical sculpture that went on the exterior of a lot of the new public architecture, including the new Hall of Records, an incredible program of both literal and allegorical historical sculptures in this building. Next, including all the mayors of New York up to that time. These freestanding monuments that many of us know in parks, the Verrazano Monument in Battery Park is one of the best stories, and how it gets set there as part of the Hudson Fulton celebration. Next. And Hudson Fulton celebration itself, which is this great, there's a next version of it going on sort of these days and in the past several months. Not sure if it's still going on or not. But the 1909 version, the 300th anniversary of Hudson founding New York and Fulton inventing the steamboat, was this occasion to celebrate, again, this fusion of New York's past that should be celebrated and the future that needs to be fueled even more. So it was sort of a great commercial and historical celebration. Next. It was organized by the preservationists, by the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Essentially, were the organizers. They did things like create replicas of the Claremont and Half Moon, the two operative ships. Next. They put them in great naval parades with, in between battleships of the Great White Fleet. They would have the replica boats. Historical floats and pageants. Float number 27 was Colonial Home. There's a chronological series of these floats. I think there were 50 of them altogether that went from this sort of, they actually had Indians that they imported from upstate New York on the first floats, and all the way back up until to the present day. Next, please. And then these fusions, both with airplane flights and with electrical displays of highlighting the past to be celebrated by putting this gloss of technology on top of it. David Nye, who wrote a great book called The American Technological Sublime, has a bunch of chapters about the Hudson Fulton celebration as this really important moment where corporate America got to sort of show its stuff technologically. Next, please. And was it popular? Yes, these are all people. On the banks of the Riverside Drive, and there's Grant's tomb is just in the back right corner there, to watch the naval parade. So this went on for months, and it was a very influential event. It was also one of the things that started the American wing of the Met. An exhibit related to the Hudson Fulton celebration became the American wing of the Met. Next, please. Okay, so do I still have time? A little bit of time? Okay, I'll quickly go through St. John's Chapel, and then we can stop when you hear more about the others. There are more slides to show about that. St. John's Chapel was built in 1803 on what was then the outskirts of the city, on the Lispenard Meadows, north and west of the Commons, to essentially make a place for wealthy and polite people to live that was not in the increasingly crowded and dirty old medieval town that New York had become. By the end of the Revolutionary War, the city had essentially grown to Chamber Street, and so this was outskirts. John McComb, the city's leading architect of the day, made designs for it. These were later found in the New York Historical Society. These are not as-built drawings. These are earlier designs. It was based on, next slide please, St. Martin in the Fields from London. And this was a view from the 1820s, looking through the park to the front of St. John's Chapel. It was designed like a proper English residential square with a square park in the middle that was private. It is essentially the Gramercy Park model with townhouses lining all sides, And on the east side, in the center, the great chapel, this great towering 200-foot Georgian spire and a portico fronting it. Next, please. Things changed in the Lower West Side over the course of the 19th century. Of course, the rich continued to move uptown. This district got taken over by businesses, by immigrant groups, and then later by shipping and the railroad. So in the 1860s, Commodore Vanderbilt bought the park against there's lots of controversy in this story, but it was never supposed to be sold. And if it was sold, the money was supposed to go back to the people who owned the houses. Essentially, the city kept most of the money, sold the park. Vanderbilt built this warehouse to the lot lines. And so by that time, the church across Barrack Street was still open, but the congregation had already changed pretty markedly and would continue to change as the century went on. Next, please. This gives you a sense of, here's the chapel, here's Barrack Street looking north, and here is what used to be the park, and it's now this amazing New York Central freight depot. West Street is here. Next. This is a subway construction, pre-subway construction photograph from, I think, 1913. Just a street side scene. You can see the old rectory of the chapel itself, and you can see much taller buildings have started to creep in around it, representing the sort of warehouses, the printing district as this was becoming, and more of the changes of the area. Next. And the one picture I've been able to find over the years of the interior of the chapel, which was a very finely decorated neoclassical Neo-Georgian room. Next. So in 1908, actually in the late 1890s, a Trinity Church, which was the mother church, this was just a chapel, a sort of sub-church of Trinity, decided to close the chapel, as they'd done with many others. As their parishioners moved uptown, they kept making new chapels for them uptown, and would close and often sell off or demolish and sell off the land of the ones that were downtown. This was proposed in the 1890s. It finally happened in 1908. But when it did, there was a great outcry. And from 1908 to 1918, there was essentially a 10-year struggle to retain, to save St. John's Chapel. And the reason I used it as a case study in the book was not because they eventually lost, and we like to have one downer story in the book to make the better stories seem better. It was eventually destroyed in 1918. I'll give that away. But over those 10 years, there was a really important transformation in the arguments that were made for its preservation. At first, it was argued that it should be preserved because the congregation deserved to continue worshiping in a place that wasn't traditionally its home. So it was this very traditional approach to history and memory that the sort of continuity of tradition was the overwhelming force. Once Trinity was able to resist the lawsuits and the pamphlets like this one that were passed out in the 8 months or so after the closing was announced, once Trinity resisted that, a number of other people came onto the scene, including people we would identify as the preservationists, and later the architects, who all had their different arguments about why the place was valuable and why it should be preserved. Preservationists often invoked Old New York. I'll put that in quotes because they did. That this was a monument to Old New York and should be saved just because of the sort of feeling and sentiment and the sense that it gives, sort of an aesthetic landmark, if you will. The architects didn't get involved until about 1914, 1915, and they began to draw the building and research its history and treat it as essentially a nice example of colonial or early federal architecture. So they didn't see the value of the preservation or necessarily its history, but really just its form. So all these arguments over time eventually failed, despite the really energetic efforts of George McEnany, which I'll show you in a second. Next, please. One of the wonderful things about this case, too, is that the newspapers were really hot on the case. The American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society knew their business as preservation advocates, and they were very tight with the newspapers. Their office was in the Tribune building. Their director, Edward Haggingham Hall, was a former newspaper man, et cetera, et cetera. They really know how to get press. And so there was a great record in the newspapers about the twists and turns of the St. John's Chapel stories. This was, I think, a 1914 story in the Sunday Times. Next, please. When the architects came in, as I mentioned, in 1914, 1915, they began to do measure drawings, just as we would do today. So, nothing new under the sun as far as preservation methodology goes. Sad to say we have better tools, but we essentially do it the same way that these folks did it. And this was published in Architectural Record. A young architect named Rawson Haddon, I've been able to find much else, did an article on St. John's Chapel and next. Also an article about these sort of typical vernacular houses in Greenwich Village, which were also being destroyed around 1914, 1915 by the extension of the subway underneath Barrack and 7th Avenue South. So he's another interesting character who shows up in the story next, please. Eventually, the building sat empty from 1908 when the congregation was kicked out and sent up into Greenwich Village or St. Luke's Chapel. They were sent to St. Luke's Chapel, where they took they took certain pieces of the interior architecture of St. John's with them to St. Luke's. And if you go there today, despite the pretty devastating fire about 10 years ago, I think it was, or less, in St. Luke's, you'll find the baptismal font, the rood screen, altar pavements, and a number of other interior pieces from St. John's that were taken there. So the building was empty from 1908 to about, certainly this photograph from 1915, I think. And the new threat to the building, Trinity just let it sit empty because they didn't want to take the blame to having it torn down. Mm-hmm. They knew, because of the plan that was published in 1907 called the New York Improvement Commission Plan, that 7th Avenue South would be blasted through the village and widened as a road, if not a subway, or both. And that since this was Barrack Street and 7th Avenue South, that eventually that would require the demolition of St. John's Chapel. So Trinity just sat tight and waited for the city to step up and say, okay, we have to tear this thing down. This is looking north up there, another of the great MTA archive photographs that show the cut and cover subway construction method. And there's the portico of St. John's Chapel, which you can see is in the way of the new 100-foot wide street. Next, please. This is one of my favorite finds from the whole project. This is looking south down Barrack Street, from north to south, through St. John's portico, just before it was destroyed, to the Woolworth building, which is a true view if you look down Barrack Street. The subway construction at first put the sidewalk underneath the portico. This was George McEnany's great investment. He spent something like $15,000 of city money, which was not an inconsiderate sum in those days, to change the plans and to preserve the portico and put the sidewalk underneath it so they could widen the street and still retain the building. The fact that he spent public money on this, I think, is really notable. There's no reason to do it other than his desire to do it. It turned out that Trinity eventually was able to sell the building anyway, so it was torn down in 1918. But for a few years, the building remained, and there were lots of hopes to reuse it as a museum, and as a school, and as a war memorial, and things like that. Because I think a lot of the architects and preservationists were consumed by World War I in various ways. There really wasn't anybody sort of left minding the store, and eventually there was no use for it, and Trinity tore it down. This remarkable image is drawn by Hugh Ferris, another name familiar in these walls, who in one of his sketchbooks drew this, what I think is a really loving portrait of this dowdy old historical building whose days were numbered. And as he sort of dashed in the background the building that, which I believe he worked directly because he worked in Cass Gilbert's office at the time Gilbert was doing the Woolworth building. Here he foregrounds the historic. So there's another image of this fusion of the past and the future somehow having some new relation to one another, even in the hands of these great minds. Next, please. So 1918, here's what finally happened. The building gets munched up by the demolition contractors, and the really banal buildings on the site take its place. Next, please. All right, so that was the end of the St. John's Chapel story. And before I launch into another hour and a half or so, I will take a sip of water and maybe open it up to questions.